It was said that in ancient times, the land of Egypt was shaped like a vast bowl. Every day, the sky poured fire into it, and every year, the Nile filled it with dark, living water. Between these two forces, the sun above and the river below, people learned to exist. They lived in a narrow strip of greenery, gently squeezed between fertile soil and endless sand, between breath and silence. From childhood, every Egyptian understood one quiet truth. Everything that is born must one day disappear. Plants rose and withered. The river came and went. Kings reigned and then disappeared. But the pharaoh was not like other people. The pharaoh was the center around which the world revolved. He was not only the ruler of men, but also the living link between earth and sky, between gods and mortals. Through him, order flowed into the earth. Crops grew. The Nile flooded at its own pace. The sun rose in balance. This order had a name, Ma'at, and it was as real as a stone beneath bare feet. When an ordinary person died, the family mourned. When a pharaoh died, the entire universe trembled. Egypt lost more than just a king. It lost its axis mundi, the pillar holding heaven and earth together. And so the pharaoh could not simply disappear into the earth like everyone else. His path had to continue. His presence had to endure. His name had to be spoken. His spirit had to be nourished. His place in the cosmic order had to be preserved. It was here that the pyramid was born, not as a monument to vanity, but as a solution to a sacred problem. The pyramid was a home for eternity, a refuge for the body, a marker for the soul, a stone staircase rising from the earth to the sun. On the high limestone ridge west of the Nile, known today as the Giza Plateau, the wind always sang softly among the rocks, slowly, unbending the sand, erasing its footprints. This was a place of eternity, solid ground, an elevated place, facing the path of the setting sun, where souls were believed to depart. Here began a great story. The first of the three giants to rise here was the pyramid built for Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. In life, his name carried the weight of power and confidence. He ruled not by chaos, but by management, planning, and an absolute faith in order. Khufu did not ask for the impossible. He demanded the inevitable. His eternal home had to be greater than any before it, not only out of pride, but so that the sun itself, crossing the sky every day, would recognize it. So that the gods would never lose sight of the king's resting place. So that Egypt would remain whole. And so, quietly and deliberately, thousands of hands began to move the stone. The first task was not construction, but preparation. The plateau had to be strong enough to support a weight no human structure had ever been able to bear. Surveyors checked the rock. Master measurers tautened ropes. Priests performed rites. Priest astronomers observed the stars at night, aligning the future walls with the eternal celestial patterns. They didn't guess. They measured. Again and again. The earth was leveled with astonishing precision. Even today, its precision astonishes engineers. This was the work not of a single inspired genius, but of an entire system. Prepared minds, shared knowledge, and patience passed down from generation to generation. Only when the earth itself was prepared did the working of the stone begin. In the nearby quarries, new quarries were opened in the light-colored limestone cliffs. Blocks were extracted from the rock using copper tools, wooden wedges, water, and time. Some stones were uncut, destined for the pyramid's core. Others were polished to a smooth, shiny finish, used for the outer cladding. These cladding stones were once a dazzling white. In the sun, the pyramid didn't look gritty or yellow as it does now. It sparkled. It reflected the sky. It looked more like a frozen ray of sunlight than a mountain. Each block was heavy, but not magical. The workers had no iron cranes, no machines powered by smoke or fire. Instead, they had organization, calculation, rhythm, endurance. The stones were laid on wooden sleds. The ground ahead was leveled and darkened with damp sand to reduce friction. When the teams pulled, they moved together, guided by voices setting a steady pace. Pull, breathe. Pull, breathe. Dozens of bodies moved as one, like a single living mechanism. Not quickly, not heroically, just constantly. Stone by stone, layer by layer, the impossible slowly took shape. As the pyramid grew, so did the ramps. Long, gentle slopes constructed of mud brick, rubble, and discarded stones. These ramps were temporary, adjusted and rebuilt as the structure was built. There was nothing superfluous here. Everything served the process. And yet, the most astonishing creation was not visible from the outside. Passages were specially cut inside the pyramid. Descending corridors led inward. Ascending paths lifted. Today, looking at the pyramids, silently towering above the sky, it's easy to imagine them as marvels, objects seemingly already formed, beyond human scale and effort. From a distance, they appear untouched by time, almost detached from the life that once surrounded them. But in their day, the pyramids weren't marvels at all. They were construction sites, noisy, crowded, dusty, and endlessly bustling. The Giza Plateau wasn't an empty desert crowned with stone. It was a vibrant place of work. In many ways, it was a city, though not one built to last. Its buildings were practical, low, and temporary. The most important material wasn't limestone, but people. A pyramid couldn't be built by random workers, assembled for a short period. It required continuity, planning, a system that could function year after year without collapsing under its own weight. Next to the pyramid stood a human machine, meticulously organized and supported by the state. For a long time, there were stories of slaves flogged and forced to carry stones in intolerable conditions. But archaeology has quietly corrected this picture. The pyramid builders were, for the most part, laborers fed, housed, and organized. One season they were farmers, the next laborers. They were artisans, masons, loaders, carpenters, rope makers, surveyors, scribes. Many came when the Nile flooded. When the river overflowed its banks, the fields were flooded. Agriculture ceased. Instead of remaining idle, farmers received assistance from the state. This was not seen as a punishment. It was a duty. Serving the pharaoh meant serving Egypt itself. Helping build the king's eternal home meant participating in maintaining balance in the world. The labor force was carefully divided. The men were grouped into teams, and the teams into larger units. These groups had names, some formal, some surprisingly warm or proud. In inscriptions, scholars have found names like Friends of Cheops, or Those Who Endured. These weren't anonymous groups. They were teams, each with its own identity. Rivalry existed, but it was controlled. One team might try to complete a section faster than another. Pride mattered, reputation mattered, and scribes stood over them all, quietly recording everything. How many blocks were moved, how long the work took, how much bread and beer was consumed, who was injured, who was absent. It wasn't chaos. It was logistics. The pyramid didn't rise in one smooth motion. It grew in stages. Layers were built, then leveled. Rows were checked and adjusted. Ramps were built to lift the stones, then dismantled and rebuilt as the height increased. The exact type of ramps used is still a matter of debate. Straight, zigzag, spiral, or some combination thereof. But whatever their shape, they weren't permanent structures. They evolved alongside the pyramid itself. Imagine the view from the plateau in those years. The The pyramid slowly rose higher. The ramps stretched forward like arms. Stone sleds slid forward. Dust hung in the air. The sounds of wood, ropes, and human voices merged into a constant background rhythm. The hardest work belonged to those hauling the stones. The work was physically demanding and monotonous. The sun beat down mercilessly. The sand reflected the heat upward. The skin darkened, muscles strained. A single block could weigh several tons. Dozens of men pulled together, holding onto ropes roughened by labor. Someone set the tempo. Someone maintained the rhythm, sometimes with their voice, sometimes with a simple blow. Pull, pause. Pull, inhale. No one pulled because it felt good. They pulled because it was necessary, because it was expected, and sometimes because it meant belonging to something greater than a single lifetime. Participating in the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza means leaving a mark that will outlive memory. But strength alone wasn't enough. The pyramid was also the product of intelligence. Skilled masons cut the stones with such precision that even today the joints between the blocks are remarkably strong. Surveyors constantly checked angles and levels, ensuring the walls remained straight and the foundation level. Architects calculated the interior spaces with astonishing foresight. Special unloading chambers were built above the royal chamber. Empty spaces designed to redistribute the enormous weight of the stone from the ceiling. These chambers were never intended to be seen. They were hidden, silent, functional. Engineering knowledge, locked in darkness, quietly and eternally carried out its work. While some labored openly, others labored behind the scenes. Near the plateau were worker settlements, rows of modest buildings, warehouses, bakeries, workshops. Grain was arriving. The most important thing in the history of the pyramids is not the pyramids themselves. It is the people. The names of the pharaohs have crossed millennia with ease. They are carved in stone, repeated in books, spoken aloud even today. But the people who lifted the stone, who measured the ground, who baked the bread, who pulled the ropes until their hands burned, most of their names have vanished. And yet, it was they who made the impossible. Every day on the Giza Plateau began in almost the same way. The sun rose quickly, with certainty, as if it, too, followed a schedule written long ago. The sand, cooled by night, still held a trace of softness beneath bare feet. This was the hour everyone waited for. Work had to begin early, before the heat grew heavy and unkind. People rose before full daylight. They ate simply, bread in the hand, a mouthful of beer to wake the body, maybe an onion for strength. Tools were gathered, ropes were checked, and then, without ceremony, they walked toward the growing mass of stone. Their lives were demanding, but they were not empty. The Egyptians lived in a world where death was not a sudden end, but a passage, a door rather than a wall. If the pharaoh passed correctly into the afterlife, Egypt remained whole. The land remained ordered. The Nile arrived on time. Crops grew. Children survived. To modern ears this may sound abstract, but to them it was as logical as the rising sun. Building the pyramid was not blind obedience. It was participation. It was a form of what might be called peace insurance, a guarantee that the balance of the world would not fracture. The pyramid was not built for vanity. It was built so life could continue calmly, predictably, season after season. The workers' settlement had its own rhythm, separate from the monument but inseparable from its purpose. Artisans worked in shaded areas, twisting fibers into strong ropes, repairing sleds worn smooth by stone, sharpening copper tools dulled by limestone. Bakers rose before everyone else, heating ovens and shaping loaves. Scribes sat quietly, recording supplies, attendance, progress. Strength alone did not determine one's role. The strongest hauled blocks. the steadiest laid stone. Those with skill in numbers checked angles and levels. Those with clear hands and sharp eyes served as surveyors. And those who could read and write, rare and valuable, became scribes, the memory of the project. Thanks to them, we know the construction was not chaos. It had reports, standards, targets, plans that adapted as the pyramid grew. It functions like a living organism, adjusting but never stopping. Of course, people grew tired. Of course, they became ill. Of course, some did not return home. Work at this scale always carries a cost. But others stood beside them, taking hold of the same ropes, continuing the same movements, closing the same shifts. Egypt could not pause the work. To stop would signal weakness, uncertainty, disorder. And disorder was dangerous. As the pyramid rose higher, the labor grew more demanding and more dangerous. Stones had to be guided into place at increasing heights. A misstep could mean a fall. A mistake in alignment could mean dismantling hours or days of work. The masons worked slowly, carefully, checking each block again and again. Sometimes a stone was moved forward for hours, only to be rejected. Sometimes it was broken and reshaped from the beginning. Speed meant nothing here. The pyramid was not meant to impress the living for a moment, but to endure longer than memory itself. Then came one of the most solemn stages of all, the casing. Smooth white limestone blocks were placed over the rough core, transforming the step structure into a perfect geometric form. In the sunlight, the surface reflected light so brightly it could be seen from great distances. The pyramid no longer looked like a construction site. It looked complete, intentional, unchangeable. At that moment, many must have understood that they were no longer simply building. They were witnessing the birth of a symbol. In time, temples rose nearby. Processional roads were laid out. Tombs of relatives, nobles, and officials clustered around the great monument. The area became a city of the dead, carefully arranged, carefully maintained. When Khufu was finally buried, rituals were performed with precision. Offers were made. His name was spoken again and again, because in Egypt, as long as a name is spoken, a person continues to exist. Centuries passed. The white casing stones were taken away, reused in other buildings. Wind softened the sharp edges. Sand covered roads and courtyards. Inscriptions faded. Temples collapsed. Dynasties ended. Kingdoms fell. But the pyramids remained. And today, standing before them, people still ask the same question. How did they do it? The answer is not lost technology. Not secret machines, not mysticism. The answer is human belief. Thousands of people belly. At first glance, the Giza pyramids appear cold and silent, stone mountains forever frozen in immobility. Their surfaces seem untouched by life, as if they had always been mere monuments. But during the years of their construction, the Giza plateau was far from lifeless. It breathed, moved, ate, and rested. And every day, beneath the rising stones, one question loomed larger than all others. Not how to lift the blocks, but how to feed the people. A hungry man can't pull a rope. A hungry man can't measure angles, keep a rhythm, or withstand the heat. A hungry man doesn't build eternity. Thousands of men worked on the plateau every day. Some transported limestone, others cut stone in quarries. Some crafted tools, made ropes, fired bricks, repaired ramps, or recorded numbers. All of them depended, above all, on one thing: food. All construction work relied on food. Bread was the staple of the workers' diet. Not the soft, airy bread of today, but dense, heavy loaves baked to sustain their strength. Egyptian bread was made from spelt or barley, ground on stone millstones. Inevitably, grains of sand and stones got into the flour. Teeth wore down quickly, but the bread provided energy that lasted for several hours. Loaves came in various shapes: round, oval, thick, or flat. Some were baked right against the walls of clay ovens. Others were baked under hot ashes. The bread was eaten plain or crumbled into water to make a thick, simple soup. After a long day in the dust and heat, when the mouth was dry and the body sluggish, this softened bread was easier to swallow and restored strength. Beer appeared alongside bread. Beer on a construction site sounds strange to a modern person. But ancient Egyptian beer was neither a luxury nor a vice. It was cloudy, weak, and nutritious, more like liquid grain than alcohol. Beer contained calories, minerals, and provided adequate hydration. And most importantly, it was safer than untreated river water, which could be a source of disease. Beer was part of the daily diet. It cooled the body, replenished lost fluids, and supported productivity. Jugs were passed from hand to hand without ceremony. Drinking beer was as commonplace as breathing. Then onions and garlic appeared. These simple foods were prized by workers. They were inexpensive, abundant, and powerful. Onions were eaten raw. Their pungent flavor helped combat dust and fatigue. Garlic was chopped, added to food, or eaten whole. The Egyptians believed that these foods strengthened the body, protected against disease, and helped them endure the heat. Whether this belief or experience persisted, this practice persisted. Vegetables supplemented the diet when available. Beans and lentils provided protein. Cucumbers provided moisture and alleviated the heat. These foods were not exotic. They were practical, easy to store, easy to prepare, and easy to distribute. Meat was less common, but it was still present. Beef, lamb, and goat were valuable resources. They were sometimes distributed during holidays, religious celebrations, or periods of particularly intense work. Specialists, overseers, and skilled artisans may have received meat more frequently than ordinary workers. The state used food strategically, distributing resources where they were most needed. Fish played a quiet but important role. The Nile was not only a river for transportation, but also a river for sustenance. Fish were caught in large quantities, then dried, salted, or cooked fresh. It provided protein and variety, and could be stored for long periods. In times of hardship, fish sated hunger. Dairy products existed, but were produced with caution. Milk spoiled quickly in the heat and had to be consumed immediately or turned into cheese. Its role was limited, but not absent. And then there were dates. Sweet, sticky, and rich in sugar, dates were small packets of quick energy. A handful could revive a tired body. They were easy to carry, easy to eat, and highly prized. In many ways, dates were the ancient equivalent of an energy ration, simple, effective, and reliable. All this food did not appear by chance. Warehouses and granaries stood next to the workers' settlement. Grain was stored. Beer was brewed continuously. Jugs, baskets, and sacks moved according to a controlled system. Scribes oversaw everything. They recorded deliveries, distributions, absences, illnesses. They noted who received full rations, who received reduced portions, and who was excused from work. Food was management. Food was planning. Food was power. Without it, the system would collapse. Now imagine an ordinary morning. The air is still cool. The sun has just begun to rise. A worker sits on a low stone or on the packed earth in front of his dwelling. He eats a piece of bread, heavy in his hand. He drinks from a jug of thick, slightly sour beer. He bites into an onion sharp enough to fully. When people imagine the builders of the pyramids, the picture is often harsh and simplified. Exhausted figures sleeping directly on the sand, abandoned, driven by despair. But the reality uncovered by archaeology is quieter, more structured, and far more human. Near the great construction site on the Giza Plateau, there existed something essential to the entire project. A real settlement, built not of legend, but of daily life. Thousands of people could not simply be scattered across the desert. They needed shelter, order, and proximity. They needed to be counted, fed, healed, and directed. And so, alongside the rising pyramid, another structure took shape. Not of limestone, but of streets, rooms, ovens, and storerooms. A living place designed to support the living. The workers' settlement was carefully planned. It included housing, warehouses, bakeries, workshops, and administrative spaces. Everything was arranged with function in mind. This was not a temporary camp thrown together in haste. It was infrastructure built to last for decades, adapting as the project grew. Housing varied according to role. Most ordinary laborers lived in long barracks, simple rectangular buildings divided into narrow sleeping areas. People slept close together on mats laid over packed earth. The air inside was warm, often heavy with the smells of dust, sweat, bread, and smoke from nearby ovens. Privacy was limited. Comfort was minimal. But these spaces provided what mattered most: shade from the sun, protection from the cold night air, and safety within a community. Skilled workers, foremen, and administrators lived differently. They often had smaller, separate houses, sometimes arranged around a modest courtyard. These dwellings offered more space, better airflow, and quieter conditions. Even within the workers' city, social distinctions were visible, not cruelly enforced, but quietly present, reflecting responsibility and skill. Inside these homes, life was simple. There was no excess furniture. Egyptians did not fill rooms with objects. A house contained only what was necessary: woven mats for sleeping, simple clay dishes, jugs for water and beer, baskets for grain or dried fish. Everything was portable. Everything had a purpose. Living compactly was not a hardship. It was adaptation to heat, labor, and limited resources. Water was the most precious element of all. Without water, the entire settlement would collapse. Jugs had to be filled, carried, and stored carefully. In the heat, water warmed quickly, so it was kept in shaded spaces, sometimes partially buried to keep it cool. Water was rationed, respected, never wasted. A single mistake, too little water after a day of hauling stone, could mean weakness, fainting, or worse. And where people work with stone, injuries are inevitable. Blocks slip, tools strike wrong angles, feet stumble, hands are crushed. Yet within the settlement, there were people trained to heal. Simple doctors and healers treated fractures with splints, wrapped wounds with bandages, applied ointments made from herbs and resins. Rest was prescribed when necessary. This is one of the most important quiet facts revealed by archaeology. Skeletons of pyramid workers show healed fractures, bones that broke and then mended. This means injured workers were not abandoned. They were allowed time to recover. They were valuable enough to be cared for. Food production formed the heart of the settlement. Large bakeries operated daily. Ovens burned constantly. Smoke rose each morning and evening as bread was baked in great quantities. Beer was brewed without pause, poured into jars, distributed with careful measure. Nearby storerooms held grain, dried goods, jars of oil and salt. These warehouses were watched closely. They were the pulse of the entire system. If food failed, work failed. If bread stopped, stone stopped. Evenings brought a different rhythm. When the heat softened and shadows lengthened, people returned from the plateau. Bodies were tired, arms heavy, skin coated in fine dust. Some leaned against walls in silence. too exhausted to speak. Others shared food. Some argued over portions or small grievances. Children laughed. Yes, children lived here too, especially among permanent workers and skilled families. Stories were told about gods, about spirits of the desert, about the river and the stars. Priests sometimes spoke, reminding people that their labor was not ordinary work, but sacred service. That through their effort, Egypt remained ordered, protected, alive. In these modest rooms, with their mats and jars and low walls, something extraordinary was sustained. Not stone, but human strength, human belief, human continuity. Great architecture does not begin at the peak of a pyramid. It begins where a worker lies down at night, rests, and rises again in the morning. And it was in this settlement, crowded, dusty, alive, that the true foundation of the pyramids was laid. If you had stood on the Giza Plateau one morning during the reign of Khufu, the first thing you would have noticed would not be the pyramid itself. It would have been the sound. Not silence, not mystery, not awe, but life. Voices carried across the stone. Bare feet scuffed the sand. Wooden sleds creaked as they were dragged into position. Tools knocked against one another with dull, familiar sounds. Somewhere nearby, a foreman called out instructions, calm but firm, and other voices answered in acknowledgement. The construction site lived according to rhythm and order, and the worker's day was bound tightly to that rhythm. The day began early, very early. Before the sun fully cleared the horizon, people were already awake. This was the most precious part of the day, the short window when the air was still cool and the body could work without fighting the heat. In the settlement, workers rose from their mats, shook dust from their clothes, and prepared themselves without ceremony. A piece of bread, a mouthful of beer or water, sometimes an onion, sharp enough to clear the sleep from the mind. There was no lingering, no slow mornings. People gathered quickly, moving in familiar groups toward the worksite. These groups mattered. Each had its task, its pace, its expectations. At the edge of the site, foremen counted heads. A scribe stood nearby, noting who had arrived and who had not. Absence disrupted the system. If one team was short, another team waited longer. Order had to be maintained. Once the morning count was complete, work unfolded into its many parts. Some workers walked toward the quarries. This was among the hardest labor of all. Limestone had to be freed from the bedrock using copper tools and wooden wedges. Dust filled the air constantly. The sun reflected off pale stone, burning the eyes and skin. Hands hardened quickly. Muscles learned the same motion over and over until the stone finally cracked free. Others worked in transport where effort became collective. The hauling of a block on a wooden sledge was a moment of intense coordination. Ropes were checked. Feet dug into the sand. One voice called the rhythm. Others responded. Bodies leaned forward together. Pull, pause. Pull, steady. If the sledge moved, the work continued smoothly. If it stuck, tension rose. Voices sharpened. Someone ran to bring water to wet the sand. Others shoved planks or rollers underneath. Nothing here was left to chance. Solutions were practical, immediate, learned through repetition. Closer to the pyramid itself worked the most experienced hands. These were the masons and setters, the men trusted to place the blocks correctly. Working at height required calm nerves and careful movement. Every stone had to be aligned. Levels were checked repeatedly. Adjustments were made slowly, sometimes taking hours for a single block. A mistake here could mean not only wasted effort, but serious injury or death. This was not work for the careless. It was work for those who understood patience. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became dangerous. By midday, the plateau shimmered. Stone radiated warmth back into the air. At this point, the pace changed. Work slowed or paused. People sought shade where it could be found. Water and beer were consumed more frequently. Foremen watched closely. A worker who pushed too hard risked collapse. And collapse was more than a personal tragedy. It was a failure of the system. The state needed its workers alive, able to return the next day. Productivity depended on survival. When the worst heat passed, work resumed in a second wave. Less intense than the morning, but still demanding. Stones were positioned. Tools were repaired. Ramps were adjusted. The pyramid continued its slow ascent, indifferent to fatigue. By late afternoon, bodies were heavy. Movements became economical. No one wasted energy on unnecessary motion. Experience taught them how to endure. And then, finally, the sun began to sink. Tools were set down. Ropes were coiled. The sound of the site softened. Groups turned back toward the settlement. Walking slowly now, shoulders slumped. Skin coated in fine dust that clung even after sweating stopped. As they approached, familiar comforts returned. The smell of bread baking, smoke rising from ovens. Voices, no longer commands, but conversation. People ate together. Bread again. Sometimes something warm. Maybe fish, maybe lentils, maybe nothing more than beer and onions. They talked about the day. About how long a block took to move. About where a sledge jammed. About who worked well. About who was punished. These conversations mattered. They reinforced bonds, shared knowledge, and reminded everyone they were not alone in the effort. Then came sleep. Quick, heavy, uncomplicated. On mats laid close together, bodies surrendered to exhaustion. Dust remained in hair and on skin. Muscles ached deeply. But sleep came fast because dawn would come again just as quickly. When people imagine pyramid robbers, the mind often reaches for drama. Flickering torches, secret maps, hidden mechanisms waiting to spring into action. A single wrong step and the ceiling collapses. But the truth, as it so often is, was quieter and far more unsettling. Tomb robbers in ancient Egypt were rarely adventurers. They were ordinary people. They lived near the necropolis. They walked past tombs every day. They understood how the dead were buried and why. And most importantly, they knew exactly what to look for. For centuries, Egyptian life revolved around death, not as an ending, but as a continuation. Tombs were built carefully. Bodies were preserved. Walls were inscribed with spells and prayers. Objects were placed beside the dead to serve them forever. Almost everyone understood one simple reality. Wealth followed the dead into the earth. Sometimes modest, sometimes immense, sometimes unimaginably rich. As long as the state was strong, this system was protected. The pyramids on the Giza Plateau were not abandoned monuments. They were active sacred spaces. Temples operated nearby. Priests performed rituals. Guards patrolled the area. Theft was not just a crime, it was a violation of cosmic order. Punishment could be severe, even fatal. But Egypt did not remain strong forever. After the age of the Great Pyramids, power shifted. Dynasties weakened. Authority fractured. Economic hardship spread. Officials went unpaid. Grain shipments failed. During these periods, guarding ancient tombs became less urgent than feeding the living. And slowly, cautiously at first, tomb robbery began. What troubles historians most is not the fact that tombs were robbed, but who robbed them. Many robbers were not outsiders breaking in under cover of darkness. They were insiders, people who already knew the system. Among them may have been former necropolis workers, temple servants, artisans who once carved stone or painted walls, participants in burial rituals, or minor officials whose wages had stopped arriving. They knew where entrances were likely hidden, They understood typical layouts. They recognized false passages for what they were. They were not guessing. They were remembering. Why take such a risk? Because the reward could change a life. A single successful robbery might uncover gold jewelry, silver vessels, precious amulets, carved stone figurines, ritual objects, ceremonial weapons, or symbols of royal authority. Even a fraction of this wealth could mean food for years, security for a family, escape from poverty. In times of hunger and instability, temptation grows quiet but powerful. It is important to understand that the pyramids were not looted all at once, nor by a single generation. Robbery was a long process, unfolding over centuries. Some intrusions may have happened surprisingly early, even while royal memory was still fresh. Later, during periods of collapse, looting accelerated. And still later, in Greek, Roman, and medieval times, new waves of intruders arrived: local diggers, opportunists, organized groups. Time, not cleverness, was their greatest ally. The methods they used were not elegant. There were no secret levers, no mystical keys. Robbers broke through walls. They dug through debris. They listened for hollow sounds. They followed cracks. They tunneled crudely, sometimes for months, abandoning passages when they failed and trying again elsewhere. Granite plugs slowed them but did not stop them. False corridors confused them but did not defeat them. Some attempts ended in nothing. Others ended in discovery. And stone, no matter how massive, yields eventually to persistence. The very fact that most pyramids were stripped of their treasures tells us something deeply human. Ancient people were patient. They were motivated. And when fear faded, they were willing to spend years breaking into structures built to last forever. Inside the pyramids, the silence returned afterward. Objects were taken. Wood decayed. Textiles vanished. Metals were melted down and reused. What remained was stone and emptiness, and the illusion, for later generations, that the pyramids had never held anything at all. But they had. And long before modern explorers arrived, others had already walked those corridors by lamplight, not in awe but in need. This is why the story of tomb robbery matters. It reminds us that the pyramids were never isolated from society. They lived within it. They suffered when society suffered. When order weakened, even eternity became vulnerable. Stone can endure for thousands of years. But human need is relentless. And given enough time, it will always find a way inside. Stories about deadly pyramid traps have fascinated people for centuries. Hidden pits, shooting arrows, clouds of poison released after thousands of years. These images feel irresistible, almost necessary. When faced with a structure as monumental as the pyramids, many assume that equally dramatic defenses must lie inside. But when the Giza Plateau is examined with calm attention, a quieter and far more practical truth emerges. The pyramids contained almost no cinematic traps at all. The reason is surprisingly simple. A real trap must meet strict conditions. It must function without maintenance for decades or centuries. It must not decay, jam, or collapse prematurely. It must activate at exactly the right moment. And it must not endanger the very people meant to enter the pyramid. Priests, caretakers, and officials who continued to perform rituals after the burial. For ancient engineering, this combination was nearly impossible. The Egyptians were master builders, but their mastery lay in stone, geometry, and mass, not in delicate mechanical systems. Springs weaken, wood rots, metal corrodes. A trap that relies on moving parts is a promise that time will eventually break. And time, above all else, was the enemy the Egyptians understood best. So instead of traps, they chose something far more reliable. They chose difficulty. The true defenses of the pyramids were not sudden death, but exhaustion, confusion, and delay. Their strategy was not to kill intruders, but to slow them down long enough that effort outweighed reward. The first line of defense was sheer mass. Millions of tons of stone pressed downward in perfect balance. Walls were thick beyond reason. Ceilings were supported by carefully calculated layers of weight-distributing stone. Breaking through was never simple. Every blow required time, strength, and noise. Inside, corridors did not invite visitors. They narrowed, sloped sharply, or changed direction without warning. Some passages descended, others rose. Some led nowhere at all. Even with knowledge that a burial chamber existed somewhere inside, a person could wander for days without finding it. One of the most effective features was the use of granite plugs. These were enormous stone blocks placed within corridors after burial. They were not traps in the dramatic sense. They did not fall or spring into action. They simply blocked the way completely. Granite is far harder than limestone. Removing or breaking such plugs required prolonged effort, tools, and coordination. For many would-be robbers, this obstacle alone was enough to halt progress. Another technique was misdirection. False passages, sealed corridors, and deceptive layouts played on expectation. A robber might follow what seemed like a logical route, only to reach a dead end. After hours or days of effort with no sign of treasure, fatigue set in. Doubt followed. Was the pyramid already looted? Was the chamber elsewhere? Was the risk worth continuing? This psychological barrier was as important as any physical one. The Egyptians also understood something subtle. Visible wealth attracts attention. So they avoided placing obvious treasures along entry routes. The absence of gold or decoration in the early passages created an impression of emptiness. A thief, already tired and uncertain, might abandon the attempt prematurely. Religious fear added another layer. For many Egyptians, violating a tomb was not merely theft. It was an offense against the gods and the cosmic order known as Ma'at. Disturbing the dead could invite divine punishment, illness, or misfortune. While desperation overcame fear for some, others hesitated. Curses did not need to be carved on walls to be believed. And there was still another form of protection: presence. The Giza pyramids were not isolated structures lost in the desert. They were part of a living complex. Temples stood nearby. Priests served daily rituals. Administrators, guards, and workers lived close to the site. While the system functioned, strangers could be noticed. Unexplained digging drew attention. Robbery was not simply a matter of slipping inside unnoticed. Protection was not only internal, it was social. This is why the pyramids seem strangely undefended today. Their defenses were never meant to be spectacular. They were meant to be effective, economical, and long-lasting. Stone does not rust. Confusion does not expire. Exhaustion works on everyone. For a long time, this strategy succeeded. It did not stop all intruders, but it slowed them. It discouraged many. It bought time, sometimes centuries. And in ancient Egypt, time was the most valuable resource of all. So why do trap stories persist? Because they are beautiful. Because they satisfy a desire for drama. Because they turn history into adventure. But the real ingenuity of the pyramids lies elsewhere, in restraint, not excess. The Egyptians did not invest in lethal machines. They invested in patience. One of the most frequently asked questions about the Giza pyramids is deceptively simple. If they were royal tombs, why are there so few treasures inside? Why are there no piles of gold, no intricate statues, no chests filled with jewels, no overwhelming sense of imperial wealth? The popular imagination, shaped by adventure novels and cinema, expects some kind of sealed vault of riches, the last, untouched gift of a vanished empire. Instead, Visitors see bare stone chambers, long corridors, rubble, and silence. This contrast is so striking that some people conclude that the very idea of pyramids as tombs is misguided. However, the emptiness itself is no mystery if we take their long history seriously. The main reason is simple. Most pyramids were looted in ancient times, not in modern times. Not by 19th century explorers, not by Napoleon's soldiers, and not by the first archaeologists. Plundering began much earlier, sometimes just decades or centuries after the pyramids were sealed. By the time of the later Egyptian dynasties, many pyramids were already considered ancient, abandoned monuments, their original contents long gone. They were old ruins on an already ancient land. The first factor is simple human behavior. Where vast riches are believed to lie, people will try to get to them. Ancient Egypt was not a forgotten civilization hidden in the jungle or desert. It was a densely populated state with continuous occupation for millennia. Royal necropolises stood alongside thriving cities, fields, and temples. The pyramids were never lost. They dominated the landscape, were visible for miles, their purpose and symbolism unmistakable. Anyone seeking riches knew exactly where to look. Secondly, treasures didn't always fall into the hands of thieves in a single dramatic act. Sometimes wealth was moved deliberately. During periods of political instability, when central authority weakened, foreign powers threatened, or internal chaos spread, priests and officials sometimes moved royal mummies and valuable funerary goods. Their goal was preservation, not theft. Kings were reburied in hidden places, often far from their original tombs, in the hope of protecting them from desecration. Some items were preserved this way, but many were later discovered and looted. What began as salvation often ended in delayed loss. Thirdly, time itself is a powerful destroyer. Even if a tomb had never been looted, much of its contents would not have survived intact. Much of the ancient wealth was organic. Wooden furniture, linen clothing, leather goods, food offerings, oils, perfumes, and resins. These materials decompose. Pyramids are not perfectly hermetic environments, especially if disturbed. Moisture, insects, bacteria, and temperature fluctuations slowly turn organic objects into dust. What once made a burial richly furnished may leave almost no visible traces after thousands of years. Fourth, there is a misconception about where the wealth was concentrated. The pyramid was not intended to function as a treasury. The burial chamber was just one element in a much larger funerary complex. Ritual life was concentrated in valley temples, causeways, and mortuary temples, where offerings were made and statues were erected. These structures contained the majority of visible splendor and material culture. The pyramid itself, by contrast, could accommodate a relatively simple sarcophagus and a limited set of ritual objects. Even under ideal conditions, it may never have contained the mountains of gold people imagine today. Finally, visibility itself hindered preservation. Later royal tombs, such as those in the Valley of the Kings, were deliberately concealed, carved into the rock and camouflaged by the landscape. This change reflects bitter experience. Pyramids, enormous and unmistakable, were constant symbols of royal burials. They proclaimed power, divinity, and presence, but also inadvertently advertised vulnerability. A structure that cannot be hidden cannot easily be preserved forever. Thus, modern visitors encounter not evidence of absence, but evidence of struggle. A long conflict between human desires, political instability, environmental destruction, and time. Empty corridors, rubble, and scarred walls tell the story of centuries of invasion and neglect. Treasures existed. They simply did not survive. However, there is a deeper paradox. Despite all that was taken from them, the pyramids ultimately stood firm. They lost gold, jewels, and sacred objects, but they retained something more lasting: memory. They still talk about faith, work, power, and humanity. If we view the construction of the pyramids solely through the prism of brute force, something important is lost. Yes, muscles pulled the stones, but muscles alone are not enough to create monuments that will last for millennia. The true unity of the project was ensured by order. And this order was created not by the people who hauled the blocks, but by those almost invisible in reliefs and in popular imagination, the scribes and administrators of ancient Egypt. A scribe in ancient Egypt was much more than just a literate worker. Literacy itself was power. Writing was rare, complex, and sacred, linked to divine order. The scribe knew how to count, keep records, standardize measures, and transform oral orders into binding instructions. In a society where most people could not read or write, the scribe became the bridge between power and action. What was written was not just a proposal, it was reality, captured in ink. At the pyramid construction site, scribes were everywhere, even if they left few physical traces behind. They documented the project's daily progress with tireless precision. They recorded how many workers showed up for work, who was absent, and why: illness, injury, ritual obligation, or punishment. They tracked the flow of stone blocks from the quarry to the river and to the ramp, noting the quantity, size, and time of delivery. They recorded how much bread and beer was issued to each crew, how many tools broke or wore out, and which crews encountered difficulties on any given day. This wasn't abstract bureaucracy. This was the logistics of survival. If a scribe miscalculated the next day's bread supply, hundreds of workers went hungry. If block deliveries weren't accurately recorded, the ramps stood idle, and labor was wasted. A delay of just one day could cause a chain reaction, disrupting schedules dependent on seasonal floods, agricultural cycles, and religious calendars. On a project that lasted decades, small errors accumulated, turning into serious risks. Scribes worked side by side with foremen. The foreman directly supervised the people, assigning tasks, maintaining discipline, and motivating the teams to achieve results. The scribe, in contrast, managed numbers, time, and accountability. If a team fell behind schedule, it was noted. If another team exceeded expectations, this was also recorded. Archaeological evidence shows that work teams were named and sometimes competed with each other, striving to be recognized as the most efficient or loyal group, the pharaoh's best team. This competition was fueled not only by the whip but also by reputation, etched in records. Above them stood layers of supervision. Senior administrators oversaw entire sectors: quarries, transport systems, ramp construction, and the pyramid core itself. These officials were directly connected to the royal court and temple institutions. Orders flowed from the bottom up. Reports flowed from the bottom up. This was not a private enterprise or a loose coalition of workers. The construction of the pyramids was a centralized state project, embedded in the political, religious, and economic machinery of Egypt. It is crucial to understand that Egypt could not afford failure. The pyramids were not built in a single generation. Workers aged, died, or returned to farming. They were replaced by new workers. Foremen changed. Even officials came and went. Nevertheless, the structure continued to evolve. Continuity was ensured by documentation. Records ensured that newcomers knew what had already been done, what standards were applied, and what goals remained unchanged. Memory was not entrusted to individuals, it was entrusted to archives. Scribes also documented conflicts. Unjustified absences were noted. Disputes between workers could escalate into formal complaints. In some cases, records attest to strikes or work stoppages due to food shortages. Order was maintained not only through authority and punishment, but also through documentation. Once recorded, events could be reviewed, evaluated, and acted upon. Writing created permanence and accountability. The irony is striking. Scribes rarely touched the stone. Their hands remained clean, their bodies protected from the strain of carrying blocks in the sun. However, without them, thousands of workers would have been nothing more than a clumsy mass. Stone itself does not conform to geometric perfection. This required planning, measurement, scheduling, and control. Ultimately, the pyramids were built not only from limestone and labor. They were the result of calculations. These were lists, calculations, schedules, and reports written on papyrus. Today, the pyramids stand not simply as stone monuments, but also as monuments to administrative work, the quiet triumph of ink over chaos. When people imagine pyramid builders, the image is almost always the same. Rows of men pulling ropes, massive blocks sliding through the sand, voices shouting in the sun. The movement of stone becomes the symbol of the entire enterprise. Yet, if we look more closely at how construction actually worked, we discover something quieter and far more complex. The pyramids weren't built solely by those moving stones. They were built by a whole hidden layer of specialists, artisans whose work is rarely depicted in reliefs, but without whom the project would have stalled almost immediately. This was the second line of construction. First, there were the rope makers. Rope wasn't a secondary tool. It was essential. Without rope, a block couldn't be pulled, stabilized, or guided. And rope is fragile. The stones tirelessly wore down their fibers. The sand thinned them with every movement. The heat dried them out and weakened them. A rope that seemed strong in the morning could fray and break by midday. Therefore, rope making was a continuous process. Artisans twisted plant fibers, flax, palm, reed, into ropes of varying thickness and strength. Some ropes were intended for towing, others for securing loads, and still others for temporary use. Old ropes were inspected strand by strand. Slightly damaged ones were repaired. Severely damaged ones were discarded and replaced with new ones. This was not an optional task. One broken rope at the wrong moment could mean crushed limbs or death. Thus, the ropemaker bore a responsibility equal to that of a loader. Their work was preventative, quiet, and constant. Then came the carpenters. Wood was scarce in Egypt, and therefore valuable. There were no endless forests from which to draw material. Every beam mattered. Carpenters crafted sleds that carried blocks, wedges that split stones, levers that shifted weight, rollers, struts, and wooden frames that supported ramps. Nothing was disposable. Sleds were repaired again and again. Cracks were patched. Weak spots were reinforced. Damaged sleds could collapse under the load, leading to lost days of work or injuries to workers. Carpenters understood tension and balance through experience, not through formulas. They listened to the wood, sensed its response, and adjusted structures as needed. Their skill transformed brute force into controlled movement. Then came the stonemasons, quiet masters of precision. They weren't just people who stacked stones. They adjusted, aligned, and perfected. The block had to be positioned correctly so its weight was evenly distributed. If pressure was concentrated in the wrong place, it could cause the stones to crack at the top or bottom, threatening the stability of entire sections. Sometimes a block that took days to quarry and transport had to be remade. Sometimes it was completely discarded. This wasn't wastefulness. It was discipline. The pyramid wasn't built for speed or spectacle. It was built for endurance. The masons worked slowly, deliberately, repeatedly checking corners and surfaces. Their labor ensured the structure's stability not only for years, but for millennia. But where people work hard, their bodies suffer. Falls happened. Stones slipped. Tools hit arms and legs. Backs strained. Joints became inflamed. Cuts became infected. And here another important figure comes into play, the doctor. Yes, medical workers were present at construction sites. Egyptian medicine was practical and grounded in experience. Healers knew how to set fractures, apply splints, bandage wounds, treat wounds, and use ointments made from fats, resins, honey, and herbs to reduce inflammation and prevent infection. They treated dislocations, managed swelling, and knew when rest was necessary. Archaeologists have discovered the skeletons of pyramid workers with healed fractures, cleanly knit bones, which prove something important. These people suffered injuries, were treated, and allowed to recover. They weren't abandoned or discarded. This detail makes all the difference. If workers had been treated as expendable, the mortality rate would have been catastrophic. Construction could not have continued for decades under such conditions. The presence of medical care demonstrates that workers were a valuable resource, not replaceable tools. There were also illnesses. Dust irritated the lungs. The heat was debilitating. Infections spread in the cramped conditions. Joints grew numb from the monotonous work. Some people died, but not endlessly, not uncontrollably. The population was supported, treated, and replenished. All these specialists, rope weavers, carpenters, masons, doctors, lived side by side with the workers. They ate the same bread, drank the same beer, breathed the same dusty air, slept in the same. A construction project of the scale seen at Giza Plateau could never have existed without discipline. But it is important to pause and understand what kind of discipline this truly was. It was not a landscape of constant terror, where people were driven forward only by fear. It was something quieter, heavier, and more durable. A system where order was maintained through obligation, surveillance, routine, and consequence. Discipline in ancient Egypt was practical. Every worker was visible within the system. If someone did not appear at dawn, it was noticed. Names were counted. Absences were marked. At first, a missed day might be questioned. Illness, injury, family obligation, these could be accepted if proven. But repeated absence without cause drew attention. And attention in such a system was rarely comfortable. Punishments existed, and they were real. Reduced rations were common. Less bread, less beer. Hunger was a powerful motivator. Forced labor could be assigned harder tasks, longer hours, less desirable duties. Corporal punishment was also part of Egyptian society. It was not exceptional. It was not theatrical. It was understood. Egypt was not a gentle civilization, but neither was it blindly cruel. A worker was valuable as long as he could work. Killing or permanently disabling laborers made no sense. The system was designed to extract effort, not destroy bodies without reason. Discipline aimed to correct behavior, not erase it. Hierarchy structured everything. At the lowest level stood the worker. Above him was the foreman, the man who knew every face, every strength, every weakness. Above the foreman stood overseers responsible for entire sections. Quarry, transport, ramps, stone placement. Above them were officials connected to the royal administration. Orders flowed downward. Reports flowed upward. Conflicts were usually resolved close to where they began. A foreman could settle disputes, assign penalties, or redistribute labor. Only serious or repeated issues traveled higher. Violence between workers was not ignored, but it was managed quickly. Chaos slowed construction, and nothing was more dangerous to the state project than chaos. Bandit leaders and brutal figures could rise in such systems, but they were the exception. Brutality without control disrupted order. What the state needed was predictability. One of the most important elements of discipline was understanding. People knew why they were working. This did not remove exhaustion, resentment, or despair. There were days of anger, days of silence, days when the stone felt heavier than it should. But the purpose was clear. The pyramid was not just a tomb. It was the state. It was the gods. It was the continuation of order. To refuse participation was not simply laziness. It could be perceived as rejecting the balance of the world itself. That belief did not make labor joyful, but it gave it meaning. And meaning is one of the strongest tools of discipline ever created. Still, there were limits. People broke. Some left the workforce and returned to their villages. Some fell ill and never recovered. Some died. The Egyptian system did not promise happiness. Promised function. It absorbed loss and replaced it. New workers arrived. Records continued. Stone rose. This is an uncomfortable truth. Great monuments are rarely born from freedom or romance. They emerge from repetition, from structure, from systems that endure longer than individuals. The pyramid did not care who pulled the rope yesterday or today. It only required that someone did. And so, day after day, the system held. When the final stones were laid and the white casing shone in the sun, there was no great celebration among the workers. No sense of standing before a wonder of the world. That idea belongs to later centuries. For the people who built it, the pyramid was a task completed. They returned to their lives. They went back to fields, to families, to new projects. Children were born. Old men died. The state continued to build, repair, and govern. The workers vanished from memory. The pyramid remained. And this is perhaps the most honest truth history can offer. Monuments endure, people pass. Stone remembers order long after the hands that shaped it are gone. The pyramids stand not because their builders were free, not because they were inspired, but because they endured. And endurance, more than any myth, is what truly shapes history. When we speak about the construction of the pyramids, the mind almost always lingers on the act itself. The hauling of stone, the glare of the sun, the rhythm of ropes and voices. But far less often do we ask the quieter question, what happened afterward? What became of the thousands of people when the final stone was set in place? When the long labor of decades finally came to an end? The pyramid did not rise in a single season. It grew slowly, patiently, across years and reigns, on the high ground of the Giza Plateau. During that time, boys became men. Men grew old. Some workers joined the project as teenagers and left it as fathers. Others never lived to see its completion. For those who worked there, the pyramid was not a wonder of the world. It was part of the landscape of their lives, like the river, the fields, the road they walked each morning. As the construction neared its end, there was no sudden emptiness, no moment when thousands were dismissed into uncertainty. Egypt did not function that way. It was a civilization built on continuity and planning. When one great task ended, another awaited. Some workers were reassigned to new state projects. Temples still needed to be built or expanded. Other necropolises required labor. Canals had to be repaired, dredged, or redirected so the Nile's waters could continue to nourish the land. Dams and embankments required constant attention. Stonecutters and masons were needed elsewhere, and experienced hands were never wasted. Many workers were farmers at heart. When the Nile receded and the black soil emerged once more, they returned to their villages. They took up plows and seed baskets, stepping back into a rhythm older than any pyramid. The same hands that once pulled stone now guided oxen and scattered grain. To the state, this was not loss but balance. Others remained within the system. Men who had learned discipline, teamwork, and endurance were valuable. They understood schedules, commands, and responsibility. Some entered temple service. Others became guards, administrators, or permanent laborers on royal projects. Experience mattered. The state remembered those who could be relied upon. It is important to understand what the workers did not receive. They were not paid in gold. They did not retire with wealth or luxury. Their compensation had always been food, shelter, medical care, and protection under the authority of the state. And yet, something else remained with them: status. In Egypt, memory carried weight. To say, "I helped build the house of the pharaoh," was not an empty phrase. It placed a person within the story of the land. It tied them to the reign of Khufu, to the maintenance of order itself. Children heard these stories. Neighbors respected them. Participation mattered, even if it did not enrich. Some workers died during the years of construction. Their graves have been found near the plateau. Simple burials, modest but deliberate. This matters. It suggests that these people were not treated as disposable. They were buried close to the place where they had worked, within sight of the monument they helped raise. Their lives were acknowledged, even if quietly. When the pyramid shifted from construction site to sacred monument, the area did not fall silent. Temples came fully into use. Priests performed daily rituals. Servants prepared offerings. Guards watched over the complex. The function changed, but life remained. The pyramid entered a new phase, no longer growing but existing. This is why it is misleading to think of a pyramid as a single event. A pyramid is a process. It begins long before the first stone is laid, in planning and belief, continues through decades of labor, and it persists long after the builders have gone, transforming from project to symbol, from workplace to sacred center. The people who built it were part of a civilization that thought not in years, but in generations. They understood that they might not see the end of what they began, and that was acceptable. The state endured. The gods endured. Stone endured. The workers returned to their lives, to fields, families, and new duties. Their names faded. Their children grew. History moved on. The pyramid remained. And in that quiet contrast, between the permanence of stone and the passing of human lives, we find one of the deepest truths of ancient Egypt. Greatness was never meant to belong to individuals. It belonged to continuity. Today, the pyramids appear ancient, worn, and almost rough, great stone masses whose surfaces seem chipped away by time. It is easy to think of this condition as decay, as loss, even as failure. But to understand the pyramids properly, it is important to remember that what we see now is not how they were meant to look. Their transformation was not sudden. It was not a catastrophe. It was a slow, nearly invisible process that unfolded over thousands of years. When the pyramids were new, they were radiant. On the Giza Plateau, the freshly completed monuments gleamed under the sun. Their outer casing was made of fine white limestone, carefully cut and polished until the joints were almost invisible. The surfaces were smooth, reflective, and precise. In the bright Egyptian light, the pyramids did not appear dull or sandy. They shone. From a distance, they must have looked less like mountains and more like enormous geometric mirrors catching the sky. These were not crude heaps of stone. They were exact shapes, measured, aligned, intentional. The lines were sharp, the angles clean. The geometry was so precise that even today it challenges modern understanding. The pyramids were statements of order, clarity, and permanence, visual expressions of cosmic balance. But time does not destroy all things at once. It erodes them patiently. The first and most decisive agent of change was not nature, but human need. As centuries passed, Egypt changed. New rulers came to power. New cities grew. Cairo expanded. Mosques, palaces, fortifications, and houses required stone. And the easiest source of high-quality, already cut limestone stood in plain sight: the pyramids themselves. The casing stones were removed gradually, not by a single decree, not in one dramatic act. Stone by stone, over generations, blocks were taken and reused. Builders pried them loose and transported them away. Some became walls of mosques. Others reinforced fortresses or lined the homes of Cairo's growing population. The pyramids did not collapse, they were slowly undressed. As the smooth casing vanished, the inner core was exposed. Unlike the casing stones, these blocks were rougher, designed to be hidden, not admired. Without protection, they became vulnerable. Then nature continued the work. Although Egypt is dry, it is not untouched by weather. Day and night temperatures fluctuate, expanding and contracting stone. Wind carries sand that abrades surfaces over centuries. Rare rains, when they come, can be sudden and destructive, seeping into cracks and weakening stone from within. Once the casing was gone, these forces worked faster. Cracks widened, edges softened. Small collapses occurred, especially where stone had already been disturbed by human hands. Earthquakes played their part as well. They were infrequent, but even minor tremors could shift massive blocks. Upper sections were especially vulnerable. A single movement could loosen stones that had rested in balance for centuries. Each tremor accelerated a process already underway. Inside the pyramids, decay followed a different path. There was less wind, less sun, but far more human interference. Every attempt to enter left scars. Robbers widened passages, dug tunnels, lit fires. Smoke blackened ceilings. Soot settled on walls. Debris accumulated. Stones were cracked, displaced, or removed entirely. Each intrusion altered the inner world. And yet, it is crucial to understand this. The pyramids did not die. They are aged. Like mountains, they changed so slowly that no single generation noticed the loss. To one lifetime, they looked the same as always. To history, the transformation is unmistakable. What is astonishing is not that they suffered damage, but that they endured it. Despite looting, quarrying, erosion, earthquakes, and centuries of neglect, the pyramids still stand. Their outer beauty has faded, but their form remains. Their mass remains. Their intention remains. This endurance speaks directly to the quality of their construction. They were not designed for centuries. They were designed for forever. Every block, every angle, every weight-bearing calculation assumed the passage of time as an enemy and prepared for it. Even stripped of their shining skin, the pyramids still fulfill their purpose. They dominate the horizon. They anchor memory. They remind the world that some structures were built not for the present, but for all that would follow. Time has taken much from them, but it has not taken their meaning. And in that quiet survival, the pyramids continue to speak, not of ruin, but of endurance beyond beauty itself. A simple question often arises, sooner or later, for anyone who looks at the pyramids long enough. Why do they still fascinate us so deeply? Why, after thousands of years, do these stone forms continue to provoke debates, inspire films, generate endless theories, and stir such strong emotions? After all, stripped of legend and romance, they are only stone. Very old stone. Very large stone. But still stone. And yet, that explanation never feels sufficient. The pyramids are not just architecture. They are the visible remains of a collective human effort so vast and so coordinated that it still feels unsettling. Modern people live surrounded by machines. Cranes lift what we cannot. Computers calculate what our minds cannot hold. Electricity flows invisibly, doing work for us even as we sleep. We are accustomed to outsourcing effort to technology. And then we stand before the pyramids. No engines, no steel, no electricity, and yet the stones rose. This creates a quiet internal conflict. A question that is not always comfortable. How could people without modern tools accomplish something that still challenges us today? The pyramids confront us with the realization that human capability does not begin with technology. It begins with organization, discipline, patience, and shared purpose. This thought unsettles a deeply rooted assumption that the past was simple, crude, primitive. The pyramids refuse to fit into that story. They stand as evidence that ancient societies could think on enormous scales, plan across generations, and coordinate thousands of lives toward a single goal. They do not flatter modern arrogance. They contradict it. There is another reason the pyramids endure in our imagination. They have outlived almost everything else humanity has built. They survived the fall of kingdoms and the rise of empires. They remained as religions changed, replaced one another, disappeared. They stood through wars, invasions, revolutions, and ideologies. Languages shifted. Peoples came and went. Borders moved. The pyramids stayed. They watched as Greeks tried to understand them, Romans tried to measure them, Arabs tried to interpret them, Europeans tried to claim them. Each civilization projected its fears, hopes, and questions onto these silent forms. The pyramids became mirrors, reflecting whatever the observer brought with them. And yet, the pyramids themselves never answered. Another powerful reason for their hold on us lies inside them. When someone finally enters a pyramid, after all the anticipation, they do not find splendor. There are no walls of gold, no painted halls, no triumphant narrative. Instead, there is emptiness, narrow corridors, bare stone, a cold, heavy sarcophagus. The silence presses inward rather than outward. It is not entertainment. It is confrontation. The pyramid does not distract. It does not explain itself. It offers no clear message, no comforting conclusion. It simply exists. And in that existence, it forces a person to think about time stretching far beyond a single life, about death as a certainty rather than a tragedy, about labor that leaves no name behind. Standing inside or before a pyramid, a person is not overwhelmed by luxury, but by absence. And absence has a strange power. It opens space for reflection. It reminds us that meaning does not always come packaged with beauty or pleasure. The pyramids are not puzzles waiting to be solved. They are not codes hiding secret knowledge. They are reminders. They remind us that behind monumental forms stand ordinary people. People who woke early, who ate bread and drank beer, who pulled ropes until their muscles burned, who argued, laughed, fell ill, healed, aged, and died. People who were disciplined, sometimes angry, sometimes hopeful, sometimes exhausted, but alive. No treasure tells that story as clearly as stone does. Gold dazzles, but it disappears. Words inspire, but they fade. Stone remains. Perhaps this is why the pyramids still touch something deep within us. They do not promise answers. They do not offer comfort. They simply testify to what humans can do when they act together, when they endure, when they accept that their work may outlast their names. In a world obsessed with speed, novelty, and individual achievement, the pyramids speak quietly of something else entirely: patience, continuity, and collective effort. And maybe that is why, even now, even stripped of their shine, even standing in silence, they continue to matter more than any treasure ever could.